Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome back. This morning we're going to speak again with Dr. Zev Ganz. This morning we're going to be speaking about school-age children. He's a personal expert in dealing with that. So, Zev, just want to introduce yourself for a minute, and then we'll get started.
Sure. I don't know if I'm a personal expert. I'm a personal expert at trying to, as I told you a minute ago, I'm a personal expert at trying to get my school-age kids to not kill each other.
Right.
So I have experience with that. Um, uh, yeah, so I'm Zev Ganz. I'm a supervisor at the Family Institute. Um, and I also work and I teach at Machon Shiluf, also in Yerushalayim. That's me.
Right. Okay, so here we go. We're going to be thinking about the corona crisis as we go in further on in these videos. We're also going further into time, the corona crisis. We're learning more and more about what helps and what needs help. So today we're going to talk about school-age kids and the particular challenge that they face in their families dealing with corona. Take it away.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, actually, the first thought I had was related to the way in which we scheduled all of our discussions, because we had planned on doing talking about babies and then school-age kids and teenagers without really thinking about the order. And so I guess naturally you and I just settled on babies first, and then I forget if you emailed me or you called me and you asked me, or you said we have school-age kids and adolescents left, and you asked me which would you like to do first, and really without thinking much about it, I said, let's just do teenagers, which interestingly is the same exact mistake that Freud made in overlooking latency age kids.
Right.
And I think there's something, the mistake that Freud and I made, I think there's something interesting about that in our readiness to disregard or overlook this age. I think there's something about the nature of school-age kids where we kind of just say, yeah, they're fine. There's not much going on.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, I think what we've discovered in the 100-something years since Freud is that that's actually not true. There's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Freud was not wrong about them. Essentially, to summarize Freud's perspective, is that he, after kids come out of the, more or less the toddler years, what he said was that school-age kids really don't have resolved the major psychosexual issues, and between the ages of like 5 and 12, 13, they could just focus on sublimation. They could focus on, and in this case, mastery and just doing stuff.
Right.
And I don't think it's wrong, but reducing it to that, I think, is overly simplistic.
Right. Well, one of my teachers, my teacher of child development was Sybil Escalona, who was one of the best developmentalists in America. And she always said, all the kids who come for treatment are in latency. And we don't study latency. We don't know anything about latency.
Yeah.
We don't know the details of latency because instinctually, Freud said there's nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
Freud was interested in new things.
Right.
And apparently, and this is important for us, spontaneously, his adult clients, some of them were adult, which was just barely out of adolescence, they didn't recall much about latency. They didn't talk much about latency. Their dreams and the things that troubled them, their associations, seemed to pull more towards early childhood, or Freud sort of listened more for early childhood. It's hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result, the assumption was that things were on hold. That's what latency means.
Right.
So I couldn't agree more. We see these kids all the time, and when we talk about them developmentally, something is happening.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to talk about, what's happening and what's happening with corona.
Yeah. And it's I mean, the interesting thing is not just Freud. Many of the developmentalists just completely overlook, even someone like Mahler, she speaks at length about babies and toddlers, and then more or less she has nothing to say. Once kids reach like 36 months, she essentially has nothing to say.
Right.
You sort of resolve rapprochement, and That's it.
Right. Well, the people who were doing pre-edible work were even worse than Freud. Freud sort of
Right.
skipped the first 2 years. He kind of, had a couple of words, and the Gamarno, the attachment people, were all about the first 3 years, and then the assumption was that nothing much,
Yeah.
much happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So I think we'll do our part to rectify that in the time we
Take it
have
up.
here. So specifically with Corona, the thoughts that I've been having relate to two statements, two phrases that anyone who has a latency age kid or who deals with latency age kids is going to hear again and again and again. And those two statements are, number one, I'm bored, and number two, it's not fair. Those are like the preeminent statements uh, of the latency age kid, and I think that both of those statements are extremely meaningful, and those statements have particular resonance in a time where everyone is at home, and what there is to do, it has become limited. I think specifically, I think, well, if we take them one by one, I think I'm bored is the statement I'm bored, I think, is a very meaningful statement, both for adults, but more specifically for kids. I think it's one of those statements that relates to, it's sort of one of these catch-all phrases that that hides emotional resonance that is difficult to just talk about. Sort of like with adult men, it often, or even adult teenage boys, it's kind of like a statement of like, it's annoying. It's annoying is much more meaningful than, it's annoying, like a fly is annoying me and it's buzzing in my face. It's annoying usually hides a whole range of emotional meanings, and I think the statement I'm bored is similar to that. The way that I've come to understand the statement of I'm bored has to do with the particular developmental stage of latency, which, like Freud says, has a lot to do with mastery. It has a lot to do with doing stuff. And if you see a school-age kid, one of the first things you'll notice is how frenetic they are. There's always activity, and it's amazing, like just how much they're doing. And if I compare it to like how exhausted I get after doing like a physical task, and then see my 10 and 8-year-olds,
Mm-hmm.
it just like puts me to shame how much they're doing and just how active they are all the time. I think on a psychodynamic level, that activity has to do with the developmental stage of latency, which I think we can conceptualize as an emergence from the dependency of uh, infancy and toddlerhood. Latency age kids are tasked with sort of bridging that divide between the dependency of being a baby or a toddler and the full independence of or the more developed independence of being an adolescent.
Right. You could
And
say, wanted to, that if you think about the world, in the German sense of Welt, which is the human world that's around you, that it's provided for you until 5 or 6. Parents provide it. And by the time you're an adolescent, you think you can take it usually by storm, but you have that relationship to it. Whereas the latency age kid, you say, well, what's my relationship to the world? Do I create the world? And so the I of I'm bored is an I that's a little small on the world. And so when there are things out there, but the question is, do I make them my world? Can I make myself a world? And the first question that you're pointing out is that, hey, where are you guys? You're supposed to provide me with the world. That's what the kids do when they say to their parents, I'm bored. Like, feed me the world. Create, and does that make sense to you?
I think it makes sense, and I think it perfectly captures that that in-betweenness where kids, when latency age kids are fully regulated, they could usually do a pretty good job of creating the world for themselves. They can think of games, they can go out and play with friends. And so I think the statement of I'm bored represents that transition, or the fear of the transition from being more independent and adult and able to create that world for themselves, to that fear of regression where, hold on, like I'm just at the brink of moving back into being a toddler. I'm just at the brink of that full dependency where I don't know what to do and I'm about to disintegrate and I can't manage and the world seems overwhelming to me. And that, I think, for latency age kids is terrifying.
In other words, I'm bored, feed me the world. Ah, you can't feed me the world, I'm not a baby. So
Right.
then,
Right, exactly. And it's as in sort of a classic human fashion, I'm bored places the onus on creating that world on the world. I'm bored, give me something to do. And that's what makes it so, speaking personally, that's what makes it so annoying for parents. Like that statement of I'm bored, it's like sort of, here I am, I kind of look like a kid who can, and in my, in my good states, in my regulated states, I don't have to rely on you so much, but here I am and I'm about to dysregulate, I'm about to disintegrate, and here it is, I'm placing it all on you. And the emotional reaction of parents is like, wait a minute, we also graduated from this state. Like, I don't want to go back there either.
right.
And the way that parents often react to I'm bored is resonant with the request, the overwhelming request that the school age kid is placing on them. I know
Right.
Personally, I can't deal with I'm bored. I've outlawed when we started Corona times. One of the things I said to my kids was that the statement "I'm bored" is outlawed in this home. And at first, I thought, like, I'm providing them a real service. I'm teaching them to be independent, and if they don't rely on board, then I'm doing something for them. And then after about a day or two, I realized it has nothing to do with what's good for my kids. I don't want to hear on board because it's super annoying.
Right. You don't want to get on board the other way. You don't want to be on board when
Right,
they're being bored.
right.
But, one of the things you can think about, which is really relevant to Corona, is that, when are latency age kids regulated? When the world has been created for them. In other words, when they go to school, let's say an average or better than average school, a bad school is another story, but let's say the average or better than average school, for most kids, there's a structure. What does that mean? There's a world. So you can live in that world. You can fulfill expectations once you know what they are. And when they go out and play, they play by rules, but they don't think that they created the rules.
Right.
If we remember Piaget and the moral development of children, the kids in Geneva who were playing marbles, anybody who's listening to this and wants to read a marvelous book, and the only one of Piaget's books that you can really understand easily. So it's right. It's the easiest one to understand.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So don't start with play, dreams, and imitation. If you do the moral development, the kids in Geneva, you ask them, well, who made the rules? And they said, oh, the town council. That's going to get to, we said about fair later. The town council made these rules. They sat down and they made them. And those are the rules. Can you change the rules? No. But that isn't a lack of independence. That just creates structure. In other words, that's the world. See, the world it's like playing Monopoly. What are the rules? Once you have the rules, you can play by the rules. Of course, you have to play by the rules. That's where we get the kids fighting about what's in the rules because they can't think past the rules. But the rules is what gives them the world. So here we are in Corona days where there's no rules. Not only that, but the world doesn't seem to have rules. And in Israel, even the requirements of what we're supposed to do, the rules keep changing. So it's even more confusing. Every day there's a different rule. Masks were not good. Masks are good. Right. And the kid would say, that makes me bored. Right? That makes it foggy. What are the rules? What is the structure? And the thing is that usually the structure of latency in a given society is pretty much a done deal, and sometimes you think, what's the reason for homework? So do something and get off your parents, but it's not just to get off your parents' back, it's actually to give you that's the world. So you can live in the world, but you can't create your own world. You can live adequately within it.
Right.
And here we are with no school. Most kids have very little school, not enough homework, no friends to play the games, and parents who, as you say, they're annoying because that's where the regressive pull is. When you're not with your parents, the world is okay. Once a parent shows up, I'm bored.
Right.
You got to feed me. And then the parents say, well,
Right.
go on. Yeah.
Well, no, I think the other point that I would add here is that the world of adults creates the world of the children. But I think one of the things that distinguishes latency age kids is their ability to create worlds themselves. Each other, in other words, the world becomes each other. The world becomes peers. We often think about this in adolescence, but it's also very striking how this is true with latency age kids, where they feel most compelled by the worlds that they create with their friends. Now, a lot of those the rules that get created in the interactions with friends are made by the outside world, right? So friends get together and they play soccer or they play baseball. Those are rules that have been written, so to speak, by the world of adults, but they're reinforced by interactions between peers.
In other words, I can play soccer, but how I play soccer and whether I'm the
Right.
lead, chalutz, or I'm the ball, I was the ball. That depends on what we do as kids.
Right. And that the fact that in soccer even though the rule is that you don't pick the ball with your hands and throw it into the net, but the fact that I don't do that is reinforced by the fact that if I do that, no one's going to want to play with me.
Right.
And kids know this is something that creates that creates the structure. It creates it supports the prevention of disintegration in these school age kids.
Right. And the main thing is that those friends are not libidinally cathected, as we used to say. Cathected is a make-up word in English, but the simple word in German means it's invested. So,
yeah.
So
I always wondered how, this is an ancillary point, but I always wondered how they got to that word cathected.
They got to it the following way. The English translation, what's called the Standard Edition,
right.
was done by some disciples of Freud named Strachey.
Right.
And they wanted it to sound very jargonistic. They thought that it would make Freud sound more scientific.
Right. Well, the Strachey's did that with lots of different words, but I always wondered specifically about cathected. It seems nonsensical.
It's a German word.
Okay.
Thesis in German means to place something, and the ka before it often would be something like this is where you place something. So the German word is just the word that's used for owning something or investing something. It's a very simple German word. So they decided that they didn't want to use the word investing. It didn't sound very scientific. So they made up a word, cathecting.
Okay.
They were not bad at Greek, not great, but a lot of listen, in medicine, everybody makes up Greek words. That way it sounds very scientific. So that's where cathexis comes from.
Got it.
But it just means, that the kids, when they're dealing with their parents and when they're dealing with their siblings, are involved with an emotionally invested issue. Your siblings took something away from you, or you took something away from them, and so it's mostly your parents. So it's a mess. And so the freedom from all of those, as family therapists, we would say, from all those family roles, from all of these sort of designed within the family, comes from friends, and that's where kids are not bored. Sometimes the boredom comes because they're conflicted, because they're stuck. As we know as therapists, when we're bored, and boredom is a deep thing in doing therapy with people, it usually says that something's made us conflicted about something. Children, as soon as they're home, they're conflicted.
Yes.
Right. And when they're not home, they're not conflicted, unless home is reproduced in school and so forth, then it gets become another story. But they're much less conflicted, and that gives them freedom to feel much more like they're creating at least the how of the world within the structure that's given them. Whereas as soon as a parent says, do this or don't do that, that has a long tail and deep roots, and it has to do with, but you didn't tell your sibling and so forth. And it becomes much, much more complex. So the world, of friends is crucial. And so here we are in Corona times, where the people who made the lockdown probably didn't think about latency age children.
I would imagine not, yeah.
In most Western world, that when society is regulated, the last thing that people think about are children, and the last of them, as you said, are the latency age kids. How is this going to be for them?
Yeah. You mean the epidemiologists weren't thinking psychodynamically?
The epidemiologist said this weren't thinking at all. That's a story.
Yeah, and I think that this does present a unique challenge. I think this time does present a unique challenge to latency age kids. I think the thought that was going through my mind when you were just speaking, and we were talking about the unique role that family plays with latency age kids, and the conflicts that arise from that. That goes to the next statement, which is very common among latency age kids, which is it's not fair. And that I think is I've come to the realization that is almost universal. When kids are having problems, it's not fair it's like just one step removed from total breakdown. I think one way to look at that is just how salient and central fairness is to us as humans. There's a great YouTube video from what's his name? Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist, and he did studies with I think rhesus monkeys, where he had two monkeys who he trained to do just some very basic task, where you give them a rock, they give it back to you, and then they get something in return. And so he starts with giving each you have two rhesus monkeys on in two adjacent cages, and he gives the first one gives a rock, and you give him a cucumber, and he's perfectly happy with the cucumber. And the second monkey gives you back the rock, and you give him a grape, and you start seeing the first one like getting really anxious, and you go back again, and he gives you back the rock, and you give him another cucumber. And what it shows in the video, and it's hilarious, I recommend looking it up, is that the monkey takes the cucumber and throws it back in the researcher's face, and then starts like pounding on his cage. And it's something, and the reason it's so humorous is because there's something very resonant with us as humans. Like we also, without inhibitions, we would also throw cucumbers back in people's faces if another person got a grape. So I think one way of thinking about it's not fair is just as a reflection of how pervasive and how central fairness is to us as humans. I think on a deeper level, it reflects those conflicts that you were talking about within the family. I think fairness is much more, the economy of fairness is much more measured, it's monitored far more intensively at home than, say, at school. When one kid gets preferential treatment at school, it can be overlooked in a way that is much more difficult at home. And I think it is a result of that monitoring of love and of care that siblings are always doing with one another. Like, what does this mean that he got this and I only got that, and I only got this? Or what does it mean that mom responded to my sister this way and responded to me that way? And so it's that I think, again, if we go back to Corona times, the intensification of home life will also lead to an intensification or potential intensification of the economy of fairness.
Right. Well, now, if we take that into the family, and we look at these two monkeys, so they've created a triangle, haven't they? In other words, that is not dyadic thinking, that's triadic thinking. And the idea that if you give him a grape, it means something about your relationship to me, that's a triangle. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that rhesus monkeys are able to do differentiation.
I'd imagine not.
But I think that probably lower mammals with no, I think we're probably a little above rhesus monkeys. Lower mammals can get stuck in triangles. I don't think they can get out of them, right, because of logos. They don't have language. And one of the things that's interesting to think about triangles is here we are in a Corona home, and everybody's intensely looking at everybody who's getting any ounce of attention. It turns out if you cry, you get attention. If you're miserable, you get attention. If you're quiet, you don't get attention. And there's a great need for something beyond attention. In other words, in Hebrew, we say tsumi, that's just attention, which is like a thing. And when you're dealing with cucumbers and grapes, and the tension is like a cucumber and a grape, there's no solution for it, because things can't be absolutely equal. And so you need to use some sort of language and thought to be able to go beyond fair. Now, what exactly is beyond fair is really connected to what differentiation is about, which is that each dyad co-creates. People probably heard this in enough of the videos, so they get the idea, that if you have a particular relationship with each kid, but you've invested in it, they feel, and let's take latency age kids, they feel that they're part of that creation. In other words, you have a special language with this one, or a special language with that one, something different with each kid, which in a normal, functioning family, you'll see, but it'll be invisible. No one will talk about it. But I think that that's one of the ways in which its cucumber is, but that's what you and I do, cucumbers. And you do grapes with him, but he doesn't do cucumbers, and I do cucumbers. And so, there's a special way in which the dyads, if each dyad is co-creational, in other words, intersubjective, then you get much less of this trouble about looking at what the other person gets. Fair is still an issue, but the sense is beyond fair is special. What people do, and if people are doing something that's only regulatory, in other words, it's only quantitative, but it's not qualitative, so then there's a cucumber, there's a grape.
Right.
Give me a grape. But if you're doing something that's qualitative with each kid, this is where we're sort of getting to what on earth are we supposed to do in Corona times with these kids? And one of the things you can't do is to be only quantitative. In other words, you can't just divide things up and say, look, when the kid says it has to be fair, as adults, it resonates with us as adults. So we say, okay, let's see how we're going to make it fair. It's an illusion.
Right. And I think that Corona, again, going back to the challenge that it presents, the central thesis of triangles is that as anxiety rises, we're going to depend more and more on the stability of the illusory stability of triangles, or the temporary stability of triangles. In other words, to translate it to the terms that we're using here, is our ability to co-create, our ability to focus on the qualitative aspects of the relationship is going to diminish, and we're going to focus more on cucumbers versus grapes as opposed to abstracting or looking at the meaning of cucumbers versus the meaning of grapes. So that I think Corona does present not just the anxiety and the limitations that it places on the children, but also the anxiety that it creates in adults. If I'm working less and money's tighter, that's going to have a real impact on my ability to respond to the inherent economy of fairness that underlies and can exist underneath the grapes and cucumbers in the relationships with my kids.
Well, especially if you look at Israeli society, and most of the news is based on fair. Most of the complaints, if you look at Facebook, is that something's not fair.
Yeah.
And some of the things are not, what you would say is objectively fair. And so adults are kind of pulled into the sense of, whatever's going on in my house is probably not fair because somebody, with more connections is getting, more masks or free of this, or was at the Seder with the kids, or wasn't, And one of the principal things that I think we're learning from Corona, from the point of view of managing of civil society, is that if you create overt unfairness without the qualitative part of it. In other words, if different groups aren't understood as different groups with different qualitative needs, but they're just seen as quantitative and who gets more and who gets less, so then that's gonna fall into the home. In other words, if you think that your neighbor is getting a better deal, let's say as an atzma'i, because he's whatever, because nobody can figure out the rules anyway, and they're going to change tomorrow. So that creates for adults a lack of security about what's fair in society, and that trickles down mostly onto latency age kids, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that in Israel, where the fairness issue is not well handled, I think most people would say there's a lot of grumbling. For example, in New Zealand, you don't see it, but here you see it all the time. And there's, whatever reasons, whoever blames who, there's always a way to blame. That creates a burden on parents to sort of create a mini society, which is different from the outer society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the truth is that, sometimes I think about schools, it's latency, elementary schools.
Sure.
And I say an elementary school is the mini society that the principal creates. The way the principal interacts in the teacher's room with the teachers, that's the society. And if you're a consultant to a school, don't look at the way they treat the kids. Look at, first of all, how they treat each other, because that's gonna, the teacher who felt that something in the division of whatever in the teacher's room was unfair, it's going to show up in class.
Yeah.
And so the same is now, but all of society is now filtered right into the home, where I would say that probably nobody thinks they're being treated fairly, for whatever. Also, we're Jews, so we think about things,
right.
and some of us are Polish Jews, so we find what's wrong with things. One of the challenges, but perhaps for Haredi families in Corona times, it may be a little easier, because a religious family doesn't think that society is what determines anything. Society is important, but there's something beyond society. So if you have a sort of general sense of gratitude and a general sense of wonder about the world, that you can say to yourself, what am I learning now and what can I do? It makes you think a little less about who's making what decision, because you know that the decisions are small compared to what's really going on, and that you're small and everybody's small, and we're also small, that it's fair. So there may be a sort of a different way of looking at it than.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point that you're making. The parallel process between how the adults relate to fairness and how we then transfer that into our relationship with kids, I think is a really interesting point. And essentially, it seems, as I think about it, it seems very true that if our focus is on the fairness that exists in other words, if we're focusing on cucumbers versus grapes in adult society, then when our kids focus on that, it's just going to resonate with us. Yeah, of course they're focusing on fairness because that's what we focus on. And to your point about Haredi society, I think that there is a real focus on the society, but it's just which society are we focusing on? My sense is that in Haredi society, the outside world, sort of beyond the four walls of the community, is kind of disregarded and assumed to be unfair. Sort of move on, like there's us and them, and the them can therefore be disregarded. The us, what's interesting is within the us, that actually has more equity than in larger society. I think that there's lots of research on. I think that there's ironically epidemiological research on rates of illness in Haredi society, and this is well replicated research, is that Haredi society has lower rates of illness as compared to other other similar socioeconomic communities, such as sort of like the Arab community, which in terms of poverty has a similar income levels. And what that's attributed to is the high rates of social capital that exist in Haredi society. And so I think within the insular community, there is the sense that, even if there's a degree of hierarchy, things are fair. You don't have to worry about that. And again, we can theorize about how that will translate into the micro level of each home specifically.
Right. In other words, one of the real challenges especially for latency age kids and families in Corona times, is to know where you draw the boundary. In other words, when you say what's fair, are you looking at the whole world? Are you looking at Asia? Are you looking at the Middle East? You're looking at Israel, you're looking at Nebra, and or Har Nof, and the main thing is that for kids, the one that they need is home. That you said you sort of make a boundary. It's like the subsystems. So there's lots of different subsystems in society, but the family that is at home becomes a subsystem. And sometimes that isn't the usual subsystem, particularly in Haredi families with lots of connections to lots of extended family people. You sort of create a new subsystem with new functions that hadn't needed to exist before because they had cousins who they were seeing all the time. And now, the cousins are perfect because cousins are connected and not connected. And uncles are perfect because it's the way your father should have been. But he's not your father, and so forth. So the functions of the extended family now get sort of cut into just a nuclear family, which has never been a major part of Haredi society. It's Western society created it and probably has regretted it ever since. But it's an economic construct that doesn't fit in all societies, and it's not a major part of the way the Haredi world works. So here you have Corona times. It's not surprising that people say, "Wait a minute, what's a nuclear family?" That's why are we putting all these functions, stripping them just on ourselves, and we're eating each other alive.
Right.
So the special the special challenge for the parents is to say, this is us now. Here we are, and we are going to make it work, and then create that kind of a world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with also the other advantage that exists it's interesting. It can be seen as either an advantage or a disadvantage, and something that I've actually been thinking about a lot is the being quarantined at home and the impact of like square meterage.
Right.
Because what Haredi families have gotten accustomed to is having lots of people in a small space,
Right.
which is what we're all challenged with right now. Now, you could think about that as a particular challenge for the Haredi world, in that now in this small space you've got everybody and no one could leave. But it could also be seen as like these families have had lots and lots of practice in maintaining this and in managing these many people in a small space.
Right. So now, if we were to let's talk about sublimations for a minute. Now, sublimations is also a peculiar term, and what it really means was defined mostly by Anna Freud. And to understand sublimations, you need to understand developmental lines, because the way Anna Freud Freud, Abba, said, look, don't ask me how the world is. I'm just trying to tell you how neurotics act in a room when they lie on a couch. That's my discovery. They come in, they lie on a couch. This is what they do. Some of them get better. This is what I think about it. The rest, I don't know. Because a good scientist knows his limits. In some ways, it's like a good physicist. Good physicists say, create simple systems. So a human being can never be a simple system. But if you lie him on a couch and see him every day at the same time for 6 months, it's closest thing to a simple system as you can get. And Freud knew that he was dealing with a simple system and not all of the world. So the general theory of how things happen was left to Anna Freud. And the concept of developmental lines is one of her main contributions. And the idea is that you bring to the world certain ways of doing things. Every baby, if you see them, it's not exactly the temperament research, because the temperament research, doesn't hold up in the laboratory for whatever reason, but except for the degree of activity. Whatever your degree of activity you're born with, that seems to be lifelong. The others seem to, vary. But if you look at how a kid at the age of 6 months eats, some kids eat one way and some kids eat another way, and how they smile or don't smile. So they bring something to the world. That's like the floor of development. Mm-hmm. And then kids start to, but there's no I in that. because they live it. They don't create it.
Right.
Then there were what she calls the coordination between the lines. You know, the example I give is that when a 2-year-old points at something and says "shoko" and is really happy before they get the shoko, because they put together language and eating. So
Right.
that those kinds of connections give pleasure to people. And then if, you know, the child also says please by some miracle, so there's a triple one, because there's object relations and language and eating. So that's a huge creation. And as a child is creating those things, you know, coordinating between the lines, that's where the I begins. That's the walls of development. Is that an idea that you're doing all the time in activity. And then ultimately, what is an ego? The ego is, you know, the ceiling of development. And that is the ability to connect things no matter what they are. The world comes at me, I connect it. Now, the one most important continuous development that goes on in latency is sublimations. And sublimations means that you're making a deep connection between your urges, instincts, drives, urges, the things that move little kids along. You can see this sort of pushed along. You know, you have this urge and thinking. In other words, so the idea of sublimation is that you can get pleasure out of thinking, that your brain becomes a secondary sexual organ. It gives you pleasure. And that is what latency age kids are doing all the time. In other words, the goal because the balance between the urges and the ability to create things, there are urges here and the abilities are here until about 6 or 7, and then probably at 7, there's a slight, it's not the urges aren't there, they're there, as Freud also recognized, but they're not dominant.
Right.
And the ability to do something with them is more dominant.
Mm-hmm.
And so between 7 and 12, there's an opportunity, because at 12, the balance changes.
Yes.
The urges are stronger than what the ability to do it with it. And so if you don't have sublimations before you get to 12, that's what Peter Bloss wrote the first chapter of his book on adolescence about latency. It's about sublimations. If you don't have the ability to do things and give you pleasure, you're not going to really be an adolescent. You're going to be a kid who's pushed along. Yeah. So then we can look at latency age kids and say, well, they're doing that all the time. That's what they're doing. It's just sort of invisible. But then we would sort of ask, is there an adult role in it? What do we, you know, because let's say they go to school and they're doing sublimation and they go out and play with their friends. When can they do sublimation? When the instincts are a little less than the ability to do something with it. When's that? When they're not conflicted, right? Put them at home, and you know the conflicts and the urges go up, and then they become stupid. In other words, it's hard for them to think through things. Yes. And so that may be one of the challenges of latency age kids stuck at home in Corona times, is how to keep them smart. Now, the interesting thing is that they like to be smart. The idea of being smart is that it gives you pleasure. It's not something against your urges. And unlike all the other so-called defenses, defenses is an urge and there's a defense that pushes against it. Right. Sublimation doesn't push against anything. It rechannels it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that if I'm bored and it's not fair are the refrains that you'll hear from kids. What you'll hear from adults when kids begin to disintegrate. In other words, when their capacities, in those moments when their capacities are not managing the urges, what you'll hear adults say to kids is, use your brain, or why don't you just or think before you act. Right. And unknowingly, adults in those moments are pointing their finger directly at what kids can't do. Right. In those moments when kids are dysregulated, that it is defined by the inability to think. And so when we tell kids just use your brain or think before you do something, we're just sort of like making fun, essentially. To a kid, it's kind of like making fun of what they can't do in that moment. You know, what's going on is that's exactly what I can't do right now.
Right. But it's exactly what I can't do alone.
Alone right now, yes. Well, they what they need, and this I think is what distinguishes latency age kids from toddlers, is that what latency age kids essentially need in those moments, they don't really need anything from parents except to be there. They need parents to sort of meet them in their regression. Right? Parents always tell me when I'm seeing latency age kids, parents are always coming and saying, like, when my kid is throwing a tantrum, I'll throw this half an hour tantrum, and you need to get you like, what do I do in those moments? And my answer to them, more or less, is I don't really know. I don't have anything. I don't really have much to give you except just be there with your kid. And what parents can do in those moments is meet them in their aggression, not expect the kid in that moment of decompensation to be able to think. And what I think happens with latency age kids, and again, this is what distinguishes them from toddlers, is that when you meet them in their aggression, they will slowly begin to pick the pieces back up themselves, and then they'll sort of go off and manage things themselves. And you'll usually be able to see that. Like, this actually just happened this morning with my 10 and 8, my 8-year-olds. I was doing a little work on my computer, and I hear them begin to kill each other. And I thought to myself, maybe I'll let them be. And then I said, well, I'm about to speak about latency age kids, so I should probably, not be a hypocrite, at least this morning. And my 8-year-old was, of course, he's the younger one, so he got he was the one that got beaten up. And he came to me, and he was really, really distraught. And I just gave him a hug, and he sort of buried his head, into my stomach for like 2 or 3 minutes. Which is, again, this is what a toddler will do. This is not what 8-year-olds are inclined to do when they are regulated. But in this moment, he was dysregulated, and he just needed to, bury his head in my stomach and cry for a moment. And then after 3 minutes, it was very, very clear. He sort of pushed me away and went off to play. In other words, as a toddler would need my help to re-engage with the world. The latency age kid, my 8-year-old, needed me to sort of just be there and help sort of meet him in his regression. And then he can go back to the tasks of latency, which is to explore and sublimate, master.
Right. In other words, what he got from you could say, is an acceptance of developmental flexibility.
Right.
Which, by the way, we use all the time in family therapy, don't we? When we say about the family, okay, let's be a 3-year-old family, let's be a 9-year-old family, let's be a 16-year-old family. And there are some families who want to be 9 and only 9. Yeah. And that's actually the problem, not the solution. Whereas if you say, well, that's human, in other words, we won't give your child's name away, but if his name is Chaim, so then I hope it's not.
No, it's not.
I use an antiquated. If his name is Chaim, then you can say, well, that's part of being Chaim. In other words, Chaim also can feel young and then get back to feeling older, whereas the toddler can't do that because he doesn't have the anchor in feeling older. But the 8-year-old Chaim can discover that burying his head in his father's stomach is part of being Chaim, so he doesn't have to struggle against it.
Right.
And that plasticity, when you say that's not what parents expect, that's part of the problem. Right. That parents expect developmental consistency. And it's not in the cards. That's not part of latency's developmental consistency.
And as fearful of kids are of regression, parents are very fearful also, because the kids have had to do hard work to sort of get themselves out of toddlerhood and be, to the place where they can sublimate and master their drives. Mm-hmm. Parents have also had to put in lots and lots of effort. And we see this, one of the scariest things for parents is that regression in their kids, because there's a part of us that says, like, wait a minute, all that hard work, is it all going to go? Is it all going to go up in smoke? I had this with my wife, where when my youngest daughter was, after she had learned to toilet train, I became like obsessed with, like, no regression. Like, she can't have any accidents. And finally, my wife said to me, like stop being insane. Like, if she makes it in her pants, it'll be fine. Like, well, she'll even if it happens, even if for a week she sort of loses the capacity to toilet train, we'll get back to, she'll be fine. And what my wife was, she was far more insightful in the ways in which development is not a full linear track, that it sort of goes in fits and stages. And even when a child achieves a developmental stage, the fact that they go back is not cataclysmic. It's sort of to be expected.
Right, right. So, but that's harder to accept in latency age kids.
Right.
I mean, that for some reason, even when adolescents go nuts, so people say, well, adolescents go nuts. Yeah. But when latency age kids slip, it sometimes freaks their parents out, and then it freaks them out in return. So this is talking about regression, and that comes before progression. But if we think about, what a latency age kid needs from his parent, once he's dysregulated, he needs to be accepted as part of him. That's the most comforting part of it, and then he gets, back in shape. But if you say, well, what makes him get dysregulated? If it's happening an awful lot, and you say it's painful and it's maybe frightening to him, how could we help him to become less dysregulated? Like, what are the points where they get dysregulated? And some of those points have to do with a task that they can't do only by themselves, right, but they can do with us. And that's one of the principal places where latency age kids are misunderstood. And that has to do with Vygotsky, right? With the fact that, if a kid is saying that's not fair, so that's the level that he can think about. But if you say to your child, if the relationship is one of a special relationship, and you say to your child, tell you how I think about it. Kids don't think about that way. I'll let you know how adults think about it. And the kid can understand what you're saying, in other words, participate in something and actually be interested in it, because it's on the way to his development, his developmental future, but he's not there yet. So he can participate in it, and that builds structure. That's what gives him pleasure, because he's gone ahead, something new has happened, but he can't do it again by himself. So the next day, he needs the same thing. It's like homework. Good homework is homework that you don't know how to do by yourself. But if you know how to do it by yourself, what's the point of it, right? Yeah. Good homework is when you need your parent to be like your teacher, to put you into developmental progress and say, here, let's do it together. And if you can do it with me, it means you're on the way to doing it yourself, and you'll get there, but there's no timing to it. Right. And that gives kids pleasure.
Yeah, I think that scaffolding is in contrast to adolescence, where that scaffolding is done. We spoke about this in our last conversation. That scaffolding is done through discussion, whether or not the adolescent actually is a participant in the discussion. We spoke about that also. Sort of sometimes you just need to talk to yourself and assume that the adolescent will listen. With school-age kids, it's not that they won't discuss, it's that their capacity to engage in discussion, right? Their verbal skills are really in their infancy. They're just getting online. Right. If we speak about my 8-year-old Chaim again, we actually had a very, very funny, to me it was funny. My wife reads, with my 10 and my 8-year-old, they read Harry Potter together. They've taken Corona times to start going through the Harry Potter series. And I think this was on...
if the world is totally crazy, you might as well just read fantasy.
Right, exactly. So I think this was on Motzach. They were reading, and they were in the middle of a chapter, and suddenly my 8-year-old says to my wife, can I be upside down while you're reading this to me? and my wife looks at him and he's like, okay. And he just takes himself and he just puts himself upside down on the couch. And I was cracking up inside. I don't know. For me, this was hilarious. I'm just thinking about like sort of the internal dialogue inside of this 8-year-old, where he's upside down. He's kind of saying to himself like, like this is much better. Right. And that's because even in reading a book, which is fantasy, the connection that's going on there is a verbal connection. And sometimes, in this case, my 8-year-old, like that wasn't sufficient. He needed some action. He needed some thing to do that would regulate himself enough to engage in that verbal interchange, right. or that verbal activity, excuse me. I think Getting back to your point, I think that the scaffolding that often needs to be done is less verbal, where we're sort of talking about what adults will do, and more active. This is when we're talking about not fair, for example, this is how an adult might relate to it, so we can abstract and go beyond the cucumbers and the grapes, as opposed to, let me tell you how I see it.
Right. No, I think you're right. In other words, you can't do the scaffolding is very precise. It has to be one step ahead, not three. If you do three steps ahead, you got to just talk to yourself. And the next step ahead has to be very concrete. It's always important to remember. Probably the most important thing that we learned from Piaget is about that age, because it's amazing just how concrete children are, even though they sound much more abstracted. You can't fully abstract things, even bright kids. So the world is very concrete, and so you'd have to translate it into something that's concrete. And in some ways, what your son did is he did something very concrete. And we have to remember that thinking isn't only verbal. In other words, turning yourself upside down is thinking. He just decided what his world was going to be. He made a different world. And that would fit with mentalization. In other words, that the world is this way, feet on the ground, and it could be feet on the ceiling, right? So what it could be, and so that gets us into the area of play. Maybe we should talk a bit about play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think if we're going to talk about play, we have to talk about Winnicott, because he was the one that taught everybody. I know it could be that you could pull some obscure 19th century reference of somebody who preceded Winnicott, but at least from my perspective, Winnicott is the person who really at least popularized how play is not it's not banal. There's a lot going on in play. And play, if we're talking about scaffolding, if we're talking about sort of that zone of proximal development, we're talking about transitions. We're talking about the ways in which kids move from one level to another level with the help of their parents. And that is also what Winnicott's concept of transitional space is related to, where kids use play to move themselves from a full focus on sort of the world inside of me into the world of not me, going back to the idea of rules and the imposition of or how kids look at the rules of their games and say this is coming from outside, even though a lot of it is coming from inside themselves and from the interactions they have with kids. But it's transitional space. Play is the way that kids manage the imperfections, the difficulties, the perturbations of the outside world, which doesn't always correspond to what goes on inside of themselves, what is perfectly reasonable or perfectly attuned to who they are. And so play is imperative in making that transition.
So then if we think about, are we just wasting time playing Monopoly or we're playing chess, or are we doing something that has developed, obviously it has relational aspects to it. And, if each if parent has a particular game, like a particular song for bedtime, like a particular set of language, for each kid, and they co-create it and play with it. Right. So that creates the dyads. But even if it's not just one-on-one, if we ask what developmental gain do we have, or is it Beetle Torah, are we doing something with kids that helps them to develop? So there we meet Vygotsky in a different article, the one about play. And there he has the following insight, which is, it's typical Vygotsky. It's just a little kvetch and things. But he said, look, in the West, he was talking about Piaget, in the West, they say that there's free play. But if I look at free play and I say, there are no rules? Well, there are rules, right? So he said, but what's overt is the fantasy. What's covert are the rules. By the way, when you watch little kids play, you usually see the family rules, right? That's one of the interesting things that happens in play. But so he says, it's not exactly free play. What we mean is there's fantasy and reality, fantasy and rules, and one's overt and one's covert. He said, no, let's look at chess or checkers. Now there, the rules are, there's only rules, right? So it flips. You see, the rules are overt, and fantasy is covert.
Yeah.
So that when when you're playing, this helped me when I was just beginning to see latency age kids in treatment. And they would bore the daylights out of people. They would want to shoot some ladders or checkers.
Right.
And then I read Vygotsky, and I started to listen to the kids, and they said, this one's eating this one. I said, no, this is an oral game.
Yeah.
So then we started to fiddle with who could eat who and who's full, and the fantasy was all over the place and became very useful. Whereas if I just said, no, what's fair, so sometimes what's fair is a way of saying with the rules to avoid the fantasy. But in playing with kids, if you can allow room for the fantasy as well, then you create what you're talking about, which is that you can unify the personality. In other words, there's the world of reality and there's a world of fantasy. And in play, you don't ask the question. That's the thing that no one had said before Winnicott,
right?
Because it's an Eastern kind of statement. The West wouldn't have it. The question you don't ask, the West always wants to ask the questions. And so he said, we just don't ask that question. That's what the kid does when the schmata is both mother and a schmata. Right. And that's what also happens in the fantasies and playing chess. If you don't ask, so you have room to play with it, the trouble is not so much for the kids. The problem is for adults to let go of the question.
Yeah.
And not start to teach about reality, but to play with reality. But playing with reality is when kids make their world. That's how they actually make their world.
Right. And I think that's one of an assessment piece for therapists when working with latency age kids is how boring is the game. For a kid, if you are playing with a kid and the game is really boring, if you're playing chess and it feels heavy and it feels boring, then that's usually a sign. That's usually an indication that this is a kid who has prematurely diluted the vitality of their games. This is a kid who has lost the capacity to play has been removed from them, where they are too focused on the rules. They can't abstract. They can't move past it. They can't impose play. They can't impose fantasy into reality, which is something that should happen during latency.
Right, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, they're not contradictory, is Lily Peller's way of looking at it. In her article about the libidinal phases in play. There she has the interesting notion, she was a Anna Freud student, that she said, if you try to pre-Oedipal kids, like 2-year-olds, when you play with them, it's boring.
Yeah.
Why is it boring? Because it's all about power. It's anal, right? In other words, it's this and it's this and it's repetitive, and it's not interesting in the sense that the fantasy hasn't entered into it yet. It's only about what this is and what that is, like a grape and a cucumber, a cucumber and a grape and a cucumber, a cucumber and a grape. And then she says that when play really becomes interesting, it becomes edible. In other words, triadic. In other words, then, see, because a kid's dyadic relationship is just, are you going to feed me now or not? Right? But when you look at somebody else and say you're feeding him, so you're also saying you could be feeding, so fantasy is entered, mentalizing. And so the idea is that triadic, or what we call free play of the preschool child, is one that's gone beyond the anal part of it, just controlling things. And the danger is that the rules in latency, instead of being a movement, a structure for play, a platform for play, it can be regressive, and then so you would look at the boring and say, well, this is an anal play.
Interesting.
Right? It'd be a different way of looking at it.
Right.
But it's sort of the same idea, that they're not freeing the developmental platform that they need. They're pulling it back into something.
Yeah. In a sense, what you're adding there is that in addition to, or the focus on the rules may represent a difficulty integrating a fantasy, sort of being flexibility, and it also may indicate a reliance or aggression towards the like the sort of the very split notion of power, or sort of being powered or disempowered.
Right, which is then going to be schizoid paranoid. It's going to be all or none. It's either me or you.
Right.
If I get, you don't get. If you get, I don't get. So now, if we try to imagine, let's say one of our trainees speaking to some parents who have a bunch of latency age kids at home, because if it's a Haredi family, if there's one, there's more than one, unless 3 or 4 latency age kids at
Likely.
home. And you sort of want to think out loud with them about how Corona times is an opportunity for what would we want our trainees to be able to think through with these parents? Because they're not going to be treating the kids right now, but they are going to be thinking with the parents about how to get out of this, put it this way, better than you went in, instead of worse than you went in.
Yeah.
Hopefully. In other words, preserving or even increasing, but at least preserving differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't become a less differentiated family as you come out of Corona. So how would you think about?
Well, I think one of the things to think about together with parents is the extent with latency age kids. There's what almost defines the challenge for parents is walking that line between intervening and not intervening. Because with adolescents, what you're going to tell parents is the challenge for you is recognizing that most of this you're powerless. Like you're not going to be, if a teenage kid says, I'm not doing this, as much as we want to think about as parents is, well, I have control over this. The fact is you don't. With toddlers and babies, it's pretty clear when the question is intervene or not intervene, the question is intervene. If the kid says, I don't want to go into the bath, and when a 4-year-old says, I don't want to go into the bath, well, you just pick the kid up and you put him into the bath. Where it becomes really true.
Maybe tickling him on the way.
Maybe, right. So you can make it playful, but ultimately you're going to just...
If you're at your best, if it's your worst, you just...
Right, you'll just move him to where he needs to go.
Right.
But that also could do, we're talking about toddlers, intervene or not intervene. If the kid is crying, do I intervene or do I not intervene? Yes, you intervene and you console the kid. If an older kid is beating up a toddler, do I intervene? Yes, you intervene. You stop the older kid from beating up the toddler.
Right.
With latency age kids, there's always a question. In all these domains, when a kid is distressed, do I intervene? Well, it depends. When kids are fighting, do I intervene? Well, it depends. If kids are getting physical with one another, do I stop an older kid from becoming physical with a younger kid? It depends.
No, what does it depend on?
And that is the question. But I think even before we get to the question of what it depends on, is appreciating the difficulty of that question is something that I think parents need to recognize. That is that giving themselves the space to ponder, again,
right.
helping them differentiate enough to think, to say, what should I do here? Sort of my impulse says do this, but maybe I need to question that impulse.
Right.
My impulse, if an older kid is, if a 10-year-old is beating up an 8-year-old, my impulse is to save the 8-year-old. But wait a minute, maybe there's something good in, let's not say beating up. My 10-year-old is physically fighting with my 8-year-old. My impulse is to come in and save the weaker kid, but maybe there's actually something good about the 8-year-old testing his strength. Maybe there's something good about the 10-year-old limiting himself enough to not completely beat up the 8-year-old.
Right.
I think sort of pausing, having appreciation for the need to pause and think is really step number one in terms of determining what does this depend on.
Right. So in other words, the first thing is to ask parents to think developmentally.
Right.
In other words, because when you say, is there something that the kid gets out of testing his strength, that's the developmental thing that he has to do in the world and you can't do for him. Right. So that's exactly where you're in the adolescent, you can't do much for him. The toddler, you do everything for him, more or less. And in the middle, it depends what he needs.
Right. And I think that this is going to be on a more constant basis. This is also going to be a question for parents as to how much time they need to invest and how much space they give to their kids. Because I think there's an opportunity in Corona times for siblings to develop a relationship with each other that they just don't get to develop when kids are off, playing with their friends. Kids are essentially forced to develop attachments with siblings that they don't need to do when they have other outlets, and there's a blessing and a challenge in that,
Right.
or there's an opportunity and a challenge within
Right.
that. But we also can't assume that latency age kids are going to be able to meet that challenge. Sometimes they're going to need us as parents. They're going to need us to play with them. They're going to need us to preempt, even if we don't allow them to say they're bored. They may need us to preempt their boredom.
Right.
I think going back to our discussion of play, sometimes our latency age kids are going to need us to play with them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Would you put the issue of fun somewhere in the equation?
I mean, I think certainly.
Yeah,
I think
that was a rhetorical question.
I took it as such. But I mean, it's interesting. You sort of, you got me to stop and think there, because I mean, my first thought was, well, of course, play should be fun.
Mm-hmm.
But I think within your question is that maybe we actually need to differentiate those terms, or maybe sometimes we can't. Maybe we can't take it for granted that play is going to be fun.
Right. Right. See, it occurs to me that, a lot of times what a parent of latency age kids, because they get pulled into this fairness and this sort of, kind of a heavy survival regulation mode, the idea is, can we stay regulated? And that will lower differentiation, because of course you want to hold on to regulation. But it occurs to me that a trainee who says to a parent, look, is there a time every day when it's fun to be your family? Fun means you enjoy each other. Fun means it's something. Now, that's not going to be 24/7, right? That's like the expectation that the kids are going to be regulated all the time. It's not in the cards.
Yeah.
But are there times, each day when the family can have fun together? And then you sort of figure out with the different kids what is fun for them, and not to push the envelope beyond, it's not going to be fun for 3 hours, but it might be fun for 45 minutes. Or, sometimes a game is the structure within which something can be fun, or until it starts to, unravel at the end. But the opportunity and the responsibility of seeing the family is enjoying each other, I think is important, probably more for latency age kids than for the other ages. What do you think?
I would agree with that, because I think that like we mentioned before, fun is the currency that latency age kids use. Whereas adolescents may be able to use words more to create that currency of connection. Fun is what creates the connection with a latency age kid.
Right. It's
And
the other side of boredom. I'm
right.
bored. This is fun.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, I think sort of using that framework, fun is an indication that for a latency age kid, fun is an indication that they are in the realm of mastery. They are sublimating. What sort of fun indicates to them that they are in the process of sublimating, whereas boredom indicates that sort of they're losing that developmental achievement and moving back into regression.
Right.
And so sometimes they can achieve fun by themselves. Sometimes we need to help them with that fun. And even beyond that, sometimes we need to be, if we want to maintain connection to our kids, we need to be part of that fun. We need to be part of that sublimation.
Right.
I think that there's a challenge here for Haredi families, in particular, where very often there's such a disparity in developmental levels, where you could have an 18-year-old, you can run the gamut from 18 or even higher to 3-year-olds. And if we're talking about having fun as a family, I think levels of differentiation are going to be very salient in terms of the ability to navigate that disparity of developmental levels. In other words, in our prototypical highly differentiated family, the 18, when we all play a 3-year-old game, the 18-year-old, while they may not be compelling, they could tolerate that because they know and they could think about the fact that, all right, the 3-year-old's having their turn right now. It doesn't mean anything about fairness, right? It doesn't mean that my parents are prefer the 3-year-old, or even if I kind of feel like it does, I can tolerate that feeling. And I also know I could have that object constancy to know that my turn's going to come. Right. Whereas in the prototypical poorly differentiated family, it's going to be very difficult to tolerate the disparity in those those levels, right? When we're all focusing on the 3-year-old, the 18-year-old, that feeling of, oh my God, everybody prefers little Yankala and they're sort of ignoring me. It's going to be hard to abstract beyond that. It's going to be hard to think through that impulse to the point where they could say, okay, I'll manage that. And consequently, those moments where we're having fun on a 3-year-old level are going to be far less tolerable for the 18-year-old or for the latency age.
Right. So you might want to ask a parent to ask themselves, first of all, to ask themselves. That's already, that's what you're saying. That's, right. Number one is, if you can't think, don't do things yet. That's, if you remember, I don't know if you were at the Laura Markham's lectures, but that was one of the main points of her parenting thing, is that, when you're not at your best, you're going to make mistakes. If you make mistakes, own them and improve them, but try to be at your best first. In other words, breathe, think, right. Get to thinking, and then, so we might say that we would encourage a parent to ask 2 questions in Corona times. One is, as a family together, have we had a moment of fun? And the other is, have I had fun with each of the children? Mm-hmm. And that's, so if there's 6 or 7 that are at home and that you're interacting with, so that's 6 or 7 questions. And that would help differentiation. Yeah. Because if it's only each kid, or it's only the whole family together, you're going to lose the intersubjective co-creation that you can do with each child. And, what's interesting is that some parents are worried that while they're co-creating with one child, the other child's going to be jealous. It's going to be the cucumbers and grapes, which is this great example that we keep going back to. Yeah. But it's not. In other words, when you're co-creating with one child, it gives the other children hope. Mm-hmm. Gives them hope because they see that it's not a cucumber or a grape. It's something that has your name on it. Then there can be something that has my name on it. Yeah. Something that, if you go back to Buber's I and Thou, people are not jealous of I and Thou. They're really jealous about it, about things that can be quantitated and so forth. But when they see co-creation, it gives them hope. Yeah. And sometimes parents don't realize that. And sometimes, it isn't exactly all the time the case, but it's significant enough that it's worth helping parents to realize that it's not giving attention. We need a different term for it. Intersubjectivity is not a good term. Right. Co-creation, not bad, but not the right term. We need some sort of a term when you say to a parent, you're doing something special with this child, and something else that's special with a different side of you, something else comes out. And so they end up seeing a parent more fully when you've seen that parent be different with the children instead of the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're the language expert, so don't rely on me to find the right word. When parents say he just needs. No, I'm in danger of making up a Greek word. People who are in the middle of it, with their kids, that's where the word comes up. Well, what I could say is when parents say to me, my kid, he just needs attention. What I'll usually say is, no, he doesn't need attention. He needs care. Care. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think it's still not a perfect word, but it gets to. I think it comes closer to what kids need than sort of just attention. Right. Could you say he needs the special you that only he knows? Probably even better, but it's not one word. Clumsy. No, they're probably not going to get one word. You try to do one word, you end up with cathexis. And other such ones. Right. I think the one thing that I'll say here is that, and this is very much related to something that we've spoken about in our other conversations, is that I think for some parents are going to need to, or sort of in line with the discussion we've had in other conversations about
not expecting second order change during Corona times and relying on first order change is when working with families, if family time is not working because it's too hard to bridge those age gaps, now is not the time to work on doing that. It's not the time to work on figuring out how my 18-year-old can get along with my 3-year-old and we could all be having fun together. If that's not working, this is the time to recognize it's not working and focus on, like what you said, is sort of focusing on those I-thou connections, on minimizing the age disparities and focusing on either one relationship or a group of ages that seem more bridgeable.
Right, right. Before we wind up, do you have some thoughts about, when we're dealing with the Haredi families, where, the language of Torah and the learning of Torah and the of notions of tefillah and of, music that's connected to tefillah is part of what happens in the family. Do you have any thoughts about how the Haredi family can or maybe, I don't think we're creating it, they're probably doing it. We can learn from people how they're creating out of those kinds of experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll tell you where my thought comes is I was looking when I was looking for something to say at my Seder.
You and everybody else.
Yeah, there's an interesting in the disparity that exists between the Chacham and the Rasha. There's lots of different words that you could focus on, but the Shibbolei Haleket focuses on the word avodah, and the Rasha, it's the Rasha that uses mahavodah zot lachem, and he focuses on that word because and what he says is that it's interesting is that the word avodah can be used in two different ways. And what the Rasha is saying is what is this work? What is this sort of this overwhelming work that you're doing? What was this work that you were doing in Mitzrayim? What's this work that you're doing now in terms of preparing for Pesach?
This is boring.
This is boring. Yes. What the Chacham is doing is he is using avodah in terms of like tefillah. Right? Avodah is also tefillah, which is something more lofty, it's spiritual and profound. So avodah can have these two meanings, and I think that's the challenge right now as Haredi families try to institute a structure around learning and around tefillah, is creating and going back to fun. Is having the flexibility to recognize and having the flexibility to create some enjoyment in these activities, where because the anxiety is going to be higher now, because we're sort of confined to small spaces, creating fun within the very serious work of learning and of davening. I think the ability to be flexible in these endeavors will go a long way towards having them as structures of connection as opposed to sort of the avodah of the Rasha.
Right. In other words, you could take the word avodah, if we remember Keegan and whether I'm in the world or I'm master of the world,
Mm-hmm.
that the Rasha sees the world as heavy on him.
Mm.
Here I am, and this avodah is on me.
Right.
And the Chacham flips it. He says, I'm doing the avodah, so I'm creating my world. It's not the world forcing me, I'm creating my world. Right. And that's, well, I'll just end with a quip that Rav Soloveitchik used to be happy to say. It's a quip, but it's like all these quips, there's something profound to it and very personal about him. He used to say, why does the Rasha come before the Tam? And the answer is because he can't talk to him. So that enters the dialogue in another way.
Right.
The answer to the Rasha is complex.
Yes.
And sometimes, you need to remember that when your kid is acting like the Rasha.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let's see. You press record. So
I will press stop recording.
There we go.